The city was alive with celebration, its usual din replaced by the rhythmic hum of excited chatter and camera shutters snapping in unison. The new subway line had been the city's most anticipated project for years, a marvel of modern engineering promising faster, more efficient transit across the sprawling urban jungle. Residents buzzed with pride, flocking to the gleaming new station for its maiden voyage. Among them was Marcel, a wiry man in his mid-30s, with a pale complexion and the hollow-eyed look of someone who didn't sleep enough. Marcel was not there to celebrate. He didn't care for civic pride or modern marvels. He had simply boarded the train because it was there, a distraction from the crushing monotony of his life. He had spent the better part of a decade as a data entry drone in a soulless corporate office, typing numbers into spreadsheets under fluorescent lights that flickered with a maddening irregularity. His therapist had suggested he get out more, so here he was, standing among the jubilant crowd, clutching the strap of his worn leather satchel like a lifeline. The station itself was unnervingly pristine, as if untouched by human hands. The white-tiled walls gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, and the air smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and ozone. There were no smudges on the glass panels, no scuffs on the polished floors, only perfection, like a dream trying too hard to convince itself it was real. The train pulled into the station, its steel body gliding silently to a halt. Marcel stepped aboard with the other passengers, finding a seat near the middle of the car. The train was equally immaculate. The seats were upholstered in dark blue fabric that didn't sag or crease. The windows were spotless, and the advertisements above the seats were too perfect, their colors unnaturally vibrant. They depicted products Marcel didn't recognize: Elixir, Serenity tablets, reality betterment solutions. The models in the ads stared directly at him, their smiles wide and frozen, eyes unnervingly intense. The doors slid shut with a pneumatic hiss, and the train jerked into motion. Marcel glanced at the other passengers. A woman in her 40s clutched a shopping bag to her chest, her gaze darting nervously around the car. A group of college students whispered and giggled in the corner, their laughter tinged with unease. An elderly man in a suit stared at his hands, which were trembling slightly. Marcel noticed a young boy sitting across from him, clutching a toy train and watching the world outside the window blur into darkness. It didn't take long for unease to creep in. The train moved smoothly, but it didn't feel quite right. The electric hum of the engine was too steady, the vibrations too uniform. Marcel tried to check his phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. He frowned, pressing the power button repeatedly. Nothing. He looked around and noticed other passengers fiddling with their devices, their faces painted with frustration or confusion. The first station came into view, a sprawling cavern illuminated by sickly yellow lights. The platform was empty, save for a row of vending machines and a single bench. The bench was occupied by a figure slumped over, their head hanging at an unnatural angle. Marcel squinted, trying to make out details, but the train sped past before he could discern anything. "That's strange," the elderly man murmured, his voice barely audible. The college students stopped laughing, their faces tense as they exchanged glances. The announcement system crackled, spitting out a garbled message before falling silent. The train didn't stop. "Maybe it's not fully operational yet," someone said, though their tone lacked conviction. Marcel's hands tightened around the strap of his bag. Something about the figure on the bench gnawed at him, an inexplicable sense of familiarity. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. "It's just a trick of the light. Don't overthink it." As the train plunged back into the tunnel, Marcel noticed the lights in the car flicker ever so slightly, just for a moment. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, though there was no source for the movement. He blinked hard, chalking it up to fatigue. The second station loomed ahead, its platform shrouded in thick mist. Marcel could barely make out shapes, a row of abandoned strollers, their wheels squeaking as they rocked back and forth. A broken carousel spun slowly, its rusted horses adorned with peeling paint. The mist seemed alive, writhing and curling, like it was trying to seep into the train. "Why aren't we stopping?" the woman with the shopping bag asked, her voice trembling. She stood and approached the doors, pressing her hands against the glass. The train sped past, leaving the eerie station behind. "Something's wrong," the elderly man muttered, louder this time. His hands had stopped trembling. Now they gripped his knees with white-knuckled intensity. The college students were silent, their earlier bravado gone. Marcel felt his chest tighten. The air in the car seemed heavier, pressing down on him. He glanced at the boy across from him, who was still clutching his toy train. The child was no longer watching the window. He was staring directly at Marcel, his wide eyes unblinking. "Hey, kid," Marcel said, his voice shaky. "You okay?" The boy tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. "We're not supposed to be here." The words hit Marcel like a punch to the gut. Before he could respond, the boy turned back to the window, humming a tuneless melody under his breath. The train continued on, its perfect rhythm becoming oppressive. Marcel glanced at his reflection in the window and froze. The image was slightly delayed, lagging by a fraction of a second. When he moved his hand to rub his eyes, the reflection didn't follow immediately. His stomach churned, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. "I want off this train," the woman said, her voice rising. She started pounding on the doors, her fists thudding dully against the glass. "Let me off." The lights flickered again, longer this time. When they stabilized, Marcel swore the car looked different. The seats were no longer pristine, the fabric appeared frayed, with faint stains that hadn't been there before. The advertisements above the seats were gone, replaced by blank panels that pulsed faintly, with an eerie, organic glow. "Calm down," the elderly man said, though his voice lacked authority. He glanced at the emergency brake, but made no move to pull it. "It's probably just a technical issue. We'll stop soon." The train surged forward, faster now. The oppressive hum grew louder, drowning out the passengers' murmurs. Marcel gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles white. His mind raced, grasping for an explanation. The boy's voice cut through the tension, soft but chilling. "It's coming." Marcel turned toward him, his throat dry. "What's coming?" The boy didn't answer. He just smiled, an unnatural, too wide smile that sent a jolt of terror through Marcel's chest. The train plunged into deeper darkness, the tunnel swallowing it whole. The darkness outside the train grew denser, an unnatural black that seemed to absorb the faint glow of the car's interior. Marcel couldn't shake the sensation that the tunnel itself was alive, pressing closer with each passing second. The air inside the train felt heavier, thick with something intangible, but suffocating. The other passengers huddled in uneasy silence, save for the boy who continued to hum that tuneless melody. Marcel's nerves were fraying. He hadn't realized how tightly he was gripping the edge of his seat until his fingertips went numb. His eyes darted to the windows, but there was nothing beyond them, no flickers of light, no sign of the outside world, just the endless black. A mechanical chime interrupted the suffocating silence, crackling through the train's speakers. "Next station, welcome." The voice was wrong. It wasn't the polished, robotic tone of a standard announcement system. It was human, or at least trying to be. The words wavered, stretching unnaturally, as though spoken by someone imitating a voice they didn't quite understand. The hair on the back of Marcel's neck stood on end. The train slowed, its brakes whining like a wounded animal. The passengers exchanged nervous glances as the car finally lurched to a stop. Marcel craned his neck to look out the window, his pulse quickening. The station was an unsettling parody of normalcy. The platform was brightly lit, almost too bright, with a nauseating yellow hue that distorted everything it touched. Rows of vending machines lined the walls, their glass fronts filled with impossible items. Jars of shadows, cans labeled "Drink Me" in jagged handwriting, and rows of teeth sealed in vacuum packaging. A series of posters covered the far wall, each depicting faceless figures staring out with blank, accusatory gazes. The most striking feature was a waiting bench in the center of the platform. A woman sat there, her back to the train. Her posture was unnervingly rigid, her head tilted to one side. Marcel felt his stomach churn. Something about her was off. Too still, too deliberate. The train doors hissed open, but no one moved. The woman on the bench began to stir, her movements jerky like a puppet on tangled strings. She turned her head toward the train, revealing a face that wasn't quite human. Her features were smudged, like a charcoal sketch that someone had smeared with their thumb. Her mouth moved silently, forming words no one could hear. The woman with the shopping bag was the first to speak. "We can't stay here," she whispered, clutching the bag tighter. "This place isn't right." As if in response, the woman on the bench stood, her legs buckled unnaturally before snapping into place. She began to walk toward the train, each step a jarring, unsteady lurch. Her smudged face twisted into a smile, wide, impossibly wide, and her movements quickened. "Close the doors," the elderly man barked, his earlier calm evaporating. The passengers shouted in agreement, their voices overlapping in panicked cacophony. The doors slid shut with a metallic groan, just as the woman on the platform reached the train. She slammed her palms against the glass, her distorted smile pressed so close that Marcel could see the cracks in her skin. It wasn't flesh, it was something else, brittle and crumbling, like dried clay. Her eyes were hollow voids, and yet Marcel felt her gaze pierce him. The train jerked forward, leaving the station behind. Marcel's heart pounded as he leaned back in his seat, trying to calm his ragged breathing. Around him, the other passengers sat in stunned silence, their faces pale and drawn. The boy across from him clutched his toy train tighter, humming louder now. "That wasn't real," one of the college students muttered, though their voice betrayed their uncertainty. "It's some kind of prank. It has to be." Marcel didn't respond. His mind raced, replaying the sight of the woman on the platform. Why did she look familiar? The thought gnawed at him, though he couldn't place her face, what little of it there was. Another station approached, the announcement chime cutting through the oppressive tension. "Next station, Comfort." The word sent a chill down Marcel's spine. He glanced at the other passengers, but no one dared speak. The train slowed again, its brakes groaning in protest as it came to a halt. This station was vastly different from the last. The platform was carpeted in soft, plush material, like the kind found in a child's playroom. Oversized furniture littered the space, a rocking horse with splintered edges, a giant teddy bear slumped against the wall, and a cracked porcelain doll sitting in a tiny armchair. The air shimmered faintly, as though the entire scene was underwater. The passengers remained frozen, their eyes fixed on the surreal tableau outside. Then, without warning, the boy across from Marcel stood. He clutched his toy train tightly, his gaze fixed on the doll in the armchair. "What are you doing?" Marcel hissed, reaching out to stop him. The boy ignored him, stepping toward the doors as they slid open. He hesitated for a moment, looking back at Marcel with an expression Marcel couldn't decipher. Then, he stepped onto the platform. "No!" Marcel shouted, lunging toward the doors. But it was too late. The boy walked toward the doll, his movements stiff and mechanical. The doll turned its head to face him, its painted smile cracking. Before Marcel could process what was happening, the doors slammed shut and the train surged forward. He pounded on the glass, his voice hoarse with panic. The boy stood motionless on the platform, staring at the doll as the train disappeared into the tunnel. "What's happening to us?" The woman with the shopping bag sobbed, her voice breaking. No one had an answer. Marcel sank back into his seat, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The train plunged deeper into the tunnel, the oppressive darkness pressing in once more. Marcel closed his eyes, but the image of the boy standing on that surreal platform was seared into his mind. He couldn't escape the thought, what if this train isn't taking us anywhere at all? What if it's only taking us deeper into ourselves? The train rattled onward, its steady hum now an oppressive drone that seemed to seep into Marcel's skull. The air inside the car felt thinner, and every breath was a conscious effort. His fellow passengers were silent, their expressions a mixture of terror and resignation. The train's interior continued to degrade. The once pristine seats were now faded and stained, the overhead panels flickering erratically. The faint pulse from the advertisement panels had grown stronger, their glow casting disconcerting shadows that writhed on the walls. Marcel leaned his head against the window, desperate to find some fragment of reality outside. Instead, the glass showed only his reflection, or what he assumed was his reflection. The face staring back at him looked wrong, subtly distorted, as though someone had stretched the features just enough to unsettle. The eyes blinked a fraction of a second too late. He recoiled, gripping the edge of his seat. "Next station, Revelation," the voice announced. It had grown even less human, the syllables dragging unnaturally, like someone forcing words through clenched teeth. The car shuddered as the train began to slow. Marcel wasn't sure he wanted to see what awaited this time. The previous stations had been bizarre, surreal glimpses into something far beyond comprehension. But there was a growing familiarity to them, a gnawing sense that these nightmares weren't random. The train screeched to a halt. The doors slid open, revealing a platform that made Marcel's stomach churn. It was a fragmented version of his childhood home. The hallway stretched into infinity, its walls smeared with handprints too small to belong to an adult. The faded wallpaper, once adorned with cheerful floral patterns, now peeled back in jagged strips, revealing pulsing veins beneath. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed through the air, accompanied by the distant sound of a child crying. Marcel's breath caught in his throat. The memories he had tried so hard to bury came flooding back. He could almost feel his younger brother's hand slipping out of his grasp in that burning house, hear the boy's screams as flames consumed everything. Marcel had survived. His brother hadn't. "No," Marcel whispered, gripping his seat. "Not here." The tapping grew louder. A door at the far end of the hall creaked open, spilling blinding light onto the platform. A figure emerged, small and shrouded in shadow, dragging something metallic behind it. "Evan?" Marcel's voice cracked. He knew it wasn't possible, but the figure's gait was unmistakable. He could see the outline of his brother's favorite toy, a metal fire truck with a dented roof. The passengers around him shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Marcel and the open doors. "Are you seeing this?" he asked, but no one responded. It was as though they were caught in their own private hells, their gazes distant and unfocused. "Don't go out there," the elderly man warned, his voice hoarse. His hands trembled as he gripped his cane, but his eyes burned with a fierce determination. "Whatever it shows you, it's not real." Marcel wanted to believe him. He wanted to stay in his seat, let the train move on, and leave this nightmare behind. But the figure on the platform began to turn, and when Marcel saw its face, his brother's face, tear-streaked and pleading, something inside him broke. "I'm sorry," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, as he rose to his feet. The woman with the shopping bag reached out to stop him, but he shrugged her off and stepped toward the doors. The air on the platform was suffocating, thick with the acrid stench of burning wood and charred fabric. Marcel's legs felt leaden as he moved forward, his eyes locked on the child. "Evan," he called, his voice trembling. "It's me. It's Marcel. I'm here." The figure paused, its tiny shoulders heaving with silent sobs. Marcel reached out, his fingertips brushing the edge of the fire truck. The metal was scalding hot, and he jerked his hand back. "You left me," the child whispered, its voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Marcel froze. The words cut deeper than any blade, dredging up guilt he had spent years trying to suppress. "I didn't mean to," Marcel said, his voice cracking. "I couldn't. There wasn't enough time." The figure turned fully now, and Marcel's stomach dropped. The child's face was a grotesque amalgamation of Evan's features, melted and warped, the flesh bubbling like molten wax. Its eyes were hollow sockets that oozed thick black liquid. "You left me," it repeated, louder this time, the voice echoing unnaturally. The hall around them seemed to close in, the walls pulsating with each word. The tapping noise resumed, growing louder and more erratic. Marcel stumbled back toward the train, but the platform stretched impossibly far, the distance between him and the open doors growing with every step. The figure advanced, dragging its fire truck, the metallic scraping sound now a deafening screech. "Please," Marcel screamed, his voice raw. "I'm sorry." The child stopped abruptly, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and it whispered, "Sorry doesn't matter here." The doors slammed shut just as Marcel reached them, and the train lurched forward, leaving him sprawled on the floor of the car. He gasped for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. The other passengers stared at him, their faces pale and unreadable. "You should have stayed seated," the elderly man muttered, shaking his head. Marcel didn't respond. He stared at his trembling hands, noticing for the first time that they were smeared with ash. He wiped them on his pants, but the stains remained, dark and unyielding. The train plunged back into the darkness, the oppressive hum now a deafening roar. Marcel closed his eyes, but the image of his brother's warped face was burned into his mind. "This isn't just a train," he thought, his chest tightening. "This is something else. It's dragging us deeper, into ourselves, into the things we can't escape." The announcement system crackled again, its garbled voice sending a fresh wave of dread through the car. "Next station, Judgment." The train rattled violently now, as though resisting the force of its own momentum. The once subtle hum of the engine had risen to a high-pitched whine, setting everyone's nerves on edge. Marcel sat slumped in his seat, his breathing shallow, his face pale. He could still feel the heat of the fire truck against his fingertips, could still hear the broken voice of the thing that had worn his brother's face. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his seat. Next station, judgment. The voice over the speakers was unmistakably human this time, but it was wrong in a way Marcel couldn't fully grasp. It carried an air of finality, like the sound of a door slamming shut. The remaining passengers exchanged nervous glances. The elderly man muttered something under his breath, clutching his cane like it was the only solid thing left in the world. The lights in the train flickered and dimmed, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe of their own accord. The air grew colder, and the faint smell of something metallic, blood, wafted through the car. Marcel forced himself to sit up, his chest tightening with every passing second. The boy was gone. The platform was gone, but the guilt remained, pressing on him like a weight he couldn't shrug off. When the train began to slow, Marcel felt the tension in the car reach its peak. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what new horror awaited them. The train ground to a halt, and the doors slid open with a metallic groan. The platform was nothing like the others. It was an infinite void, stretching endlessly in every direction, broken only by a single structure, a towering black mirror that reflected the passengers with unnerving clarity. The mirror seemed alive, its surface rippling like water. Marcel stared at his own reflection, his stomach nodding as he noticed the small discrepancies. His eyes were sunken, his face more hollowed than it should have been. The reflection tilted its head, independent of his own movements. The other passengers hesitated, standing frozen at the open doors. The elderly man was the first to speak. "Don't go out there. Whatever it shows you, it'll destroy you." "Destroy us?" snapped one of the college students, their voice tinged with hysteria. "We've been trapped on this nightmare train for how long? Hours? Days? And you think staying here will save us?" The student pushed past Marcel and stepped onto the platform. The void seemed to ripple around them, and the mirror's surface shimmered as they approached. Marcel wanted to shout a warning, but his voice caught in his throat. The student stood before the mirror, staring into their reflection. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the reflection began to change. The student's face twisted, their features warping into something grotesque, a snarling, monstrous version of themselves. The reflection sneered, raising a hand. The student mirrored the motion involuntarily, their arm trembling as though being forced by an unseen puppeteer. "Stop!" the student screamed, but the reflection didn't obey. Instead, it reached through the glass, grabbing the student by the throat. The others watched in horror as the mirror dragged them inside, their screams fading into the void. The surface of the mirror rippled once more, and the student's reflection was gone. "Stay in the train," the elderly man said firmly, gripping Marcel's arm. "It's a trick. It feeds on your guilt." Marcel wrenched free, his jaw tightening. And what happens if the train keeps moving? To where? What's worse than this? The elderly man didn't answer. He simply shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor. Another passenger, a woman Marcel hadn't noticed before, stepped forward. "I don't care what happens," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't stay here." She walked toward the mirror, tears streaming down her face. Marcel watched helplessly as she knelt before the glass, speaking softly to her reflection. The mirror shimmered, and the woman's image began to change, showing her cradling a child that wasn't there. Marcel's chest tightened. The child in the reflection looked eerily like the boy who had disappeared earlier. As the woman reached for the glass, Marcel turned away. He couldn't watch another person be consumed by the thing. His gaze shifted to the other passengers, most of them frozen in terror, some whispering prayers. The train doors remained open, as if daring them to step into the void. Marcel looked back at the mirror. His own reflection stared at him, its eyes dark and accusing. The words echoed in his mind, unspoken but deafening. "You left him." "I didn't mean to," Marcel whispered, taking a step toward the platform. The elderly man grabbed his arm again, but Marcel shook him off. "I have to face it." "No one escapes this," the man said, his voice breaking. "Don't you understand? It's not about redemption, it's about feeding it." Marcel ignored him and stepped out of the train. The cold void enveloped him immediately, and the faint hum of the train faded into silence. The mirror loomed before him, its surface rippling in anticipation. His reflection stared back at him, unblinking. "You know why you're here," the reflection said, its voice his own, but twisted, distorted. "You've always known." Marcel clenched his fists, his heart pounding. "I didn't have a choice." The reflection smirked. "There's always a choice. You made yours. Now you're here." The mirror's surface darkened, and the image shifted. Marcel saw the fire again, the choking smoke, the flames devouring his childhood home. He saw his brother's face, tear-streaked and terrified, reaching out to him. "Help me," Evan whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "I'm sorry," Marcel choked, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't save you." The reflection stepped forward, emerging from the mirror. It stood inches from Marcel, its warped face twisted into a grotesque mockery of his own. "Sorry isn't enough," it said, raising a hand. Marcel flinched, but nothing happened. The reflection stared at him, its expression unreadable. Then, slowly, it stepped back into the mirror, disappearing into the void. The platform began to dissolve, the darkness closing in around him. Marcel turned toward the train, but the doors were gone. The car itself had vanished, leaving him alone in the endless void. A voice echoed in the darkness, cold and final. Judgment rendered. The void swallowed him whole,